So about 3 years ago, my wife and I were living in Nottingham. We had been there for 8 years. We were working with a lot of Chinese young adults, a lot of students. And around that time, God began to stir us and speak to us about taking a small rural church south of Cambridge called Therfield Chapel. At first, was not at all interested. I had just come through to speak once. They had expressed interest in having me as their pastor. They had been without pastor for a while and were looking for one. And it didn't seem the sort of place I wanted to go. It was a bit old. I was just about the youngest person in the chapel when I spoke, and that's me in my mid to late 30s. So I thought, no, this just isn't us. This isn't the young crowd I'm used to. This isn't a city church. But bit by bit, through prayer and through counsel, godly counsel of other people, began to feel it was the right move. So 2.5 years ago, by the grace of God, we accepted the call to go down to Therfield Chapel. And for me, it was a bit of a reluctant obedience. I was doing it because this is what Christ was calling me to do. Shortly after taking over the church, God turned my reluctancy into a real sense of joy that He was with me and with my family. And during that time, God dropped the word hospitality into my heart. Now, the church that I had taken over had seen a great revival back in the 1970s, and it grew to a tremendous number, well over 100 people. But since the 70s onward, it slowly began to decline, so that when I took over, there was only about 30 people attending on a Sunday morning. And one of the things we noticed was that not much had changed in the interior of the church. A lot of the things that were still happening were being done the way they had been done in decades previous. And so it lacked a sort of warmth and hospitality and sort of a modern feel that would make maybe anyone under the age of 40 feel just slightly out of place, like it was their grandmother's church instead of their church. So we invested time and money and a lot of work into refurbishing the place. We brought in some sofas in the back, got some proper coffee makers, changed up the speakers a little bit, and tried to give it a new look, not so that we could impress people with in any way being cool or hip, but just to make people feel welcome and let them know that, hey, this is a church for you and we're really glad you came. We knew if there was going to be a real revitalization within the church, if once again we were going to start getting new people and younger people, it would have to be a work of the Holy Spirit. So one of the first things we did was we called a Sunday night prayer gathering, and over 20 people showed up, which, considering there were only about 30 people attending the church on a Sunday morning, that was a big deal. People came together, and as we prayed, it was the most supernatural sort of thing. We felt a presence of Christ there in a unique way, in a powerful way. Many of our people who are not at all given to emotionalism or overt expressions of emotions walked away from that prayer time crying. And from that time on Sunday mornings, there was a fresh sense that we're not just gathering to hear a sermon about God or sing songs to God, we're coming to meet with God. One of the great stories that happened very early on after we began to gather together to pray on a Sunday night was one Sunday night we actually all gathered to the door of the church and laid our hands on the frames of the church and prayed that God would bring in new people, because no one new had really joined the church in about 7 years. So we all prayed for the church, and that very next week, that next Sunday morning, this young couple shows up. And of course, not being used to a lot of visitors, I went over and introduced myself and said, "How did you hear about us?" And they said, "Oh, we were just hiking through the countryside last weekend and we saw this little chapel and we just said to each other, you know what, we should show up on Sunday and see what it's like." Well, the husband has just become a member and is actively involved in one of our Bible studies. So in the last 2.5 years, God has brought me from being a reluctant pastor, taking on a congregation I wasn't even sure I entirely wanted, to being at a place of great joy, of great thankfulness, and seeing Him faithfully work with my wife and I to see this church that had once seen revival once again come to life, be effective in mission, see new people reached, new baptisms, and I'm so glad He called me out of my home in Nottingham down there to Therfield.